The winter of 1957 carved its name into the frozen soil of Plainfield, Wisconsin, with fingers made of bone and sinew. On November 15th, when the morning fog rolled across the barren fields like a burial shroud, Sheriff Arthur Schley pushed open the door to Ed Gein's farmhouse and stepped into a nightmare that would redefine the boundaries of human darkness. The smell hit him first, sweet decay mixed with the metallic tang of old blood, a scent that would follow him to his grave and beyond. What they found in those rotting walls wasn't just the work of a madman. It was a catalog of horrors so precise, so methodical, that even seasoned investigators would later whisper about government experiments gone wrong, about programs that turned human beings into something else entirely. The lampshades weren't just made of skin. They were crafted with the patience of an artist, the precision of a surgeon, the devotion of a priest conducting his most sacred ritual. Before we continue into this abyss of truth, if you can still hear my voice, it means you haven't looked away. Subscribe now, not for entertainment, but to see what others are too afraid to know, because what happened in Plainfield wasn't an isolated incident. It was a window into something much larger, much darker, and much more organized than anyone dared to admit. The official reports would later claim it was the work of a single disturbed individual. But the evidence tells a different story, one written in blood and silence, in missing files and convenient deaths, in witnesses who vanished like morning mist and investigations that ended before they truly began. The truth about Plainfield exists in the shadows between official documentation and classified reality, in the spaces where government oversight met criminal experimentation and produced something that defied every assumption about the nature of evil. In the autumn of 1957, America was already drowning in its own shadows. The Cold War had transformed paranoia into a national religion, and in the basement laboratories of places like Los Alamos and the underground facilities near Groom Lake, scientists were conducting experiments that would make Mengele's work look like child's play. Project MK Ultra was in full swing, pumping LSD into unwitting subjects, fracturing minds like glass, searching for the perfect weapon hidden in the human psyche. But there were other programs, darker ones, programs that didn't appear in any congressional hearing or Senate subcommittee report, programs that studied the complete dissolution of human empathy, the systematic destruction of moral barriers, the creation of individuals so thoroughly broken that they could perform acts of unimaginable cruelty without hesitation or remorse. The researchers called them empty vessels, human shells capable of carrying out any order, no matter how horrific. The research facilities scattered across the American Midwest in the 1950s were conducting experiments that pushed the boundaries of ethical science into territories that would later be recognized as crimes against humanity. Deep beneath the cornfields of Iowa, in nondescript buildings near military installations, psychologists and psychiatrists were mapping the human mind's capacity for evil. They were learning how to break a person so completely that they would willingly participate in their own destruction, and then turn that same violence outward onto others. These facilities operated under the cover of agricultural research stations and veterans' hospitals, their true purpose hidden beneath layers of bureaucratic obfuscation and classified funding streams. The subjects were often recruited from psychiatric institutions, military veterans suffering from combat trauma, and individuals from marginalized communities who wouldn't be missed if they disappeared. The research was systematic, methodical, and utterly without regard for human dignity or suffering. Ed Gein had served in the Pacific during World War II, though his military records remain curiously incomplete. What we do know is that he returned to Plainfield changed, hollowed out, speaking in whispers about things he claimed to have seen in places that didn't officially exist. His neighbors noticed the transformation, the way he would stare at nothing for hours, the way he would disappear for days at a time, returning with new tools and an expression that suggested he had been practicing something unspeakable. The war had created perfect conditions for psychological experimentation. Soldiers returning from combat were natural subjects for studies on trauma, dissociation, and the malleable nature of human identity. Many veterans reported being subjected to extensive debriefings that seemed more like interrogations, sessions that left them confused about their own memories and uncertain about what they had actually experienced. These weren't standard military procedures. They were field tests for techniques that would later be refined in civilian populations. Military psychologists during this period were particularly interested in what they termed combat effectiveness enhancement, methods for creating soldiers who could kill without hesitation, torture without remorse, and follow orders regardless of their moral implications. The research involved systematic exposure to increasingly extreme forms of violence, chemical conditioning to suppress empathetic responses, and psychological conditioning techniques designed to fragment the personality into controllable segments. The Gein farmhouse sat on 160 acres of Wisconsin soil that had been in the family for generations. But in the years following Ed's return from the war, that land became something else entirely. Local hunters reported finding animal carcasses arranged in patterns that seemed to serve no practical purpose, geometric designs that spoke of ritual rather than necessity. Children walking to school would detour miles out of their way rather than pass too close to the Gein property, though none could articulate why. The transformation of the property was gradual but systematic. Outbuildings were modified with surgical precision, equipped with drainage systems and ventilation that suggested uses far removed from traditional farming. The basement was excavated and reinforced, creating spaces that resembled laboratory environments more than root cellars. These modifications were carried out over several years, often by workers who arrived without explanation and left no records of their employment. The transformation accelerated after the death of Ed's mother Augusta in 1945. She had been the only constant in his fractured world, the single thread connecting him to whatever remained of his humanity. When she died, that thread snapped with an audible crack that seemed to echo across the entire county. Within months, the first disappearances began. Augusta's death marked more than personal loss. It represented the removal of the final psychological barrier preventing the full activation of whatever conditioning Ed had received during his military service. Psychiatric evaluations conducted years later would reveal that many subjects in experimental programs required the removal of emotional anchors before they could fully embrace their programmed behaviors. Augusta's death provided that final severance from normalcy. Local records from the Plainfield area show an unusual pattern of missing persons reports filed between 1946 and 1957. Women would vanish without explanation, leaving behind cars with keys in the ignition, purses containing money, and homes where dinner was still warm on the table. The investigating officers would file reports that described thorough searches, but witnesses later claimed that certain areas around the Gein property were declared off-limits during these investigations, cordoned off by men in military uniforms who provided no explanation for their presence.
The pattern of disappearances followed a mathematical precision that suggested careful planning rather than opportunistic crime. Victims were selected based on specific criteria: age, physical characteristics, social isolation, and psychological profiles that made them ideal subjects for whatever research was being conducted. Each disappearance was timed to coincide with periods when Gein had been observed, meeting with unidentified visitors at his farmhouse. Bernice Worden vanished on November 16, 1957, from her hardware store in Plainfield. The last entry in her sales receipt book was for antifreeze, sold to Ed Gein, but by the time Sheriff Schley connected that simple transaction to the nightmare they discovered in Gein's farmhouse, Bernice had become something else entirely, part of a collection that defied every assumption about human nature and criminal behavior. The timing of Bernice Worden's disappearance was significant in ways that would not become apparent until years later. Congressional hearings on military psychological research programs were scheduled to begin in early 1958, and investigators were beginning to uncover evidence of unauthorized experimentation on American civilians. Bernice's disappearance provided the final piece of evidence needed to expose the Plainfield operation while simultaneously discrediting any suggestions of government involvement. What they found hanging in Gein's shed wasn't just a body. It was a work of art, displayed with the reverence of a museum curator presenting his most prized acquisition. Bernice Worden had been decapitated, gutted, and suspended from the ceiling by ropes around her ankles. But the precision of the work, the surgical cleanliness of the cuts, the almost ritualistic arrangement of the scene, these details spoke of training, of practice, of guidance from someone who understood anatomy at a level far beyond that of a simple farmer. The medical examiner's report, portions of which remain classified, described surgical techniques that required years of training to master. The removal of skin had been performed with instruments that left characteristic marks matching those found on bodies recovered from other locations across the Midwest. The preservation methods showed knowledge of chemical processes that weren't taught in agricultural colleges. This was, and the improvised butchery of a deranged mind. It was the careful work of someone who had been extensively trained in human anatomy and tissue preservation. Forensic pathologists who examined the remains identified techniques that were consistent with procedures taught in military field hospitals during World War II, specifically methods for rapid tissue harvest and preservation under battlefield conditions. The precision of the cuts, the systematic approach to organ removal, and the chemical preservation methods all pointed to someone with extensive medical training and access to specialized equipment. The inventory of horrors discovered throughout the farmhouse read like a supply list for some unimaginable ceremony: 10 female skulls, some with the tops sawed off to create makeshift bowls, a shoebox containing 9 masks made from human faces, each one carefully preserved and maintained, a belt made from female nipples, a wastepaper basket crafted from human skin, chair seats upholstered with the flesh of women whose names had been forgotten by everyone except the man who had transformed them into furniture. But perhaps most disturbing were the personal items: a lipstick tube, a pair of reading glasses, a wedding ring still warm to the touch despite having been separated from its owner for years. These weren't trophies in the traditional sense. They were components of something larger, pieces of a puzzle that law enforcement was neither equipped nor authorized to solve. Hidden throughout the house were notebooks filled with detailed observations about the decomposition process, chemical formulas for preservation solutions, and anatomical diagrams that showed the optimal methods for skin removal. The handwriting matched Gein's, but the technical language and scientific methodology suggested external instruction. These weren't the random scribblings of a madman, they were research notes, documentation of ongoing experiments in human biology and psychology. The notebooks contained references to subject conditioning protocols, behavioral modification through trauma exposure, and physiological responses to systematic depersonalization. The language was clinical, professional, and entirely inconsistent with the educational background of a Wisconsin farmer. More disturbing were the detailed psychological profiles of each victim, assessments that revealed intimate knowledge of their fears, desires, and psychological vulnerabilities. The FBI arrived in Plainfield within hours of the initial discovery, moving with the efficiency of an organization that had been expecting this call. Special Agent Robert McCarthy, a man whose personnel file remains classified to this day, took control of the investigation with an authority that superseded local jurisdiction. Within 24 hours, key pieces of evidence had been transferred to undisclosed locations for specialized analysis never to be seen again. Agent McCarthy's background, revealed through leaked documents decades later, included extensive work with the CIA's Technical Services Division, specializing in what internal memos referred to as behavioral modification through trauma conditioning. His previous assignments had taken him to research facilities across the country where psychologists were developing techniques for creating what they termed programmed subjects, individuals whose personalities had been so thoroughly fragmented that they could be directed to perform any action without moral hesitation. The speed and efficiency of the federal response suggested that the Plainfield situation had been anticipated, possibly even orchestrated, as part of a larger containment protocol. Evidence collection followed procedures that seemed designed more to control information than to gather facts. Key witnesses were isolated and subjected to intensive questioning that resembled interrogation more than standard police interviews. If you're still here, it means you're one of the few who search for truth in the dark. Subscribe because stories like this don't stay online for long, and the patterns connecting Plainfield to other incidents across the country become clear only to those willing to see them. The official psychological evaluation of Ed Gein, conducted at the Waupun State Hospital, concluded that he was suffering from schizophrenia and was unfit to stand trial. But the psychiatrist who conducted that evaluation, Dr. Edward Kelly, had previously worked for the CIA's Psychological Warfare Division, specializing in techniques for creating dissociative disorders in captured enemy agents. His report on Gein contained language that seemed less concerned with treatment than with documentation, as if he were cataloging the success of a long-term experiment rather than examining a mentally ill patient. Dr. Kelly's files, partially declassified in the 1990s, reveal a pattern of patients who had been subjected to experimental treatments designed to fragment their personalities and create what he termed operational alters, separate identities that could be activated to perform specific tasks while the primary personality remained unaware. The techniques involved prolonged sensory deprivation, chemical conditioning, and systematic trauma designed to shatter the mind's natural defense mechanisms. The psychiatric evaluation process itself was revealing. Gein was subjected to a battery of tests that were not standard psychiatric assessment tools, but rather experimental protocols designed to map the structure of artificially created personality fragments. Brain scans showed patterns of neural activity consistent with severe trauma conditioning, and his responses to psychological triggers suggested the presence of multiple programmed behavioral patterns.
The transcripts of Gein's interviews reveal a man who spoke about his crimes with the detached professionalism of someone describing a technical procedure. When asked why he had removed the skin from his victims' faces, he replied with clinical precision about the importance of preserving the expressions and maintaining the connection between interior and exterior states. These weren't the words of a delusional farmer. They were the terminology of someone who had been taught to think about human beings as raw materials for a specific type of construction project. During one recorded session, Gein described in detail the process of selecting victims, explaining that he had been taught to identify women who fit specific psychological profiles, those who were isolated, unlikely to be missed immediately, and possessed of certain physical characteristics that made them suitable for the work. He spoke of meetings with men in suits who would arrive at his farm to inspect his progress and provide new instructions, meetings that were documented in appointment books found hidden in the farmhouse basement. These sessions revealed the existence of a complex support network that extended far beyond Plainfield. Gein described regular visits from supervisors who would evaluate his progress, provide new equipment, and give instructions for upcoming operations. He spoke of training sessions conducted at remote locations, where he was taught advanced techniques for human tissue preservation and psychological manipulation of potential victims. Mary Hogan had disappeared from her tavern in Pine Grove 3 years before Bernice Worden's murder on December 8, 1954. The official investigation concluded that she had simply left town without notice, despite the pool of blood found behind the bar and the .22 caliber bullet discovered embedded in the wall. But forensic evidence later revealed that Mary Hogan's face had become one of the masks found in Gein's collection, her skin carefully removed and tanned using techniques that would have required considerable expertise in preservation methods. The Mary Hogan case represented the first successful test of the operational protocol that would later be perfected with subsequent victims. Her disappearance was carefully orchestrated to appear accidental, while the actual crime was conducted according to specific research parameters. The preservation of her remains demonstrated the effectiveness of the chemical and surgical techniques being developed through the program. The pattern extended beyond Wisconsin. In the months following the Plainfield discovery, law enforcement agencies across the Midwest began reviewing unsolved disappearances dating back to 1946. Women who had vanished without explanation, leaving behind cars with keys in the ignition and purses still containing money. The geographical distribution of these disappearances formed a network centered on several military installations and research facilities, creating a pattern that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. Files recovered from a storage facility in Chicago in 1978 contained maps marking the locations of disappearances across 7 states, with annotations in handwriting that matched samples found in Gein's notebooks. The maps showed a systematic progression, moving outward from research facilities in concentric circles, as if someone were testing the effectiveness of their methods in increasingly distant locations while maintaining centralized oversight of the entire operation. The geographic analysis revealed a sophisticated operational structure that extended across multiple states and involved coordination between various government agencies and private contractors. Each disappearance corresponded to specific research objectives, with victims selected according to predetermined criteria and their remains processed according to standardized protocols developed at military research facilities. Project Artichoke, the predecessor to MK Ultra, had been experimenting with the complete destruction of individual identities since 1951. Declassified documents reference Project Vessel. a subsection dedicated to creating subjects capable of performing extreme acts of depersonalization without psychological breakdown. The geographic markers associated with Project Vessel correspond almost exactly with the locations where women disappeared between 1946 and 1957, creating a map of horror that law enforcement was ordered to ignore. The research goals of Project Vessel, as outlined in surviving documents, involved creating individuals who could function normally in society while maintaining the capacity for extreme violence when triggered by specific cues. The subjects would retain no memory of their actions, allowing them to pass any psychological evaluation while remaining available for future activation. The program represented the ultimate evolution of mind control research, the creation of perfect assassins who didn't even know they were weapons. Project Vessel represented the culmination of decades of research into human behavior modification and the practical application of psychological warfare techniques on domestic populations. The program's goals extended beyond simple assassination. Researchers were developing methods for creating subjects capable of infiltrating any organization, gathering intelligence, and eliminating targets without detection or memory of their actions. The Gein farmhouse was demolished in March 1958, less than 4 months after the initial discovery. The official explanation cited structural damage and contamination concerns, but witnesses reported that the demolition crew worked exclusively at night, using equipment that seemed designed more for decontamination than simple destruction. The soil itself was removed to a depth of 6 feet and replaced with sand trucked in from a quarry whose ownership could not be traced through any public records. Before the demolition, teams of specialists spent weeks inside the farmhouse, photographing every surface, cataloging every artifact, and removing materials that were never included in any evidence inventory. Local residents reported seeing trucks loaded with laboratory equipment leaving the property at all hours, escorted by military vehicles that bore no identifying markings. The cleanup operation had the characteristics of a containment protocol rather than a criminal investigation. The systematic removal of evidence extended to all associated locations. Buildings that had been used for storage burial sites in the surrounding woods, and even the local cemetery, where several victims had been temporarily interred. All were subjected to intensive cleanup operations that removed any trace of the experimental program, its activities. Augusta Gein's grave was exhumed twice in the years following her son's arrest, both times under court orders that remain sealed. Cemetery workers reported that the casket was empty during the second exhumation, though no official explanation was ever provided. Some theorized that Ed had removed his mother's body shortly after her burial in 1945, but the precision of the subsequent disappearances suggests something far more systematic than filial devotion. The psychiatric reports from Waupun State Hospital describe a patient who exhibited what Dr. Kelly termed selective amnesia regarding external guidance. Under hypnosis, Gein would become agitated when asked about his methods of preservation or the source of his anatomical knowledge, claiming to hear voices that gave instruction from places that weren't supposed to exist. These sessions were recorded on equipment provided by the Department of Defense, and the tapes were classified under national security provisions within days of their creation. Analysis of the hypnosis transcripts reveals a pattern of responses that suggests Gein had been conditioned to forget certain aspects of his activities while retaining the technical skills necessary to continue the work. He could describe in perfect detail the process of skin removal, but claimed no memory of learning these techniques. He could recite chemical formulas for tissue preservation, but insisted he had never studied chemistry. This selective amnesia was consistent with conditioning techniques being developed at research facilities across the country. The hypnosis sessions revealed the existence of what psychiatrists termed compartmentalized memory structures, artificially created mental barriers that prevented the subject from accessing certain memories while under normal consciousness. These barriers could be removed through specific triggers, allowing researchers to access operational memories while maintaining the subject's cover identity. Agent McCarthy's final report to FBI Director Hoover partially declassified in 1978, contained references to operational success and containment protocols maintained throughout exposure period. The language suggested that the Plainfield incident had been anticipated, possibly even orchestrated, as part of a larger research initiative designed to test public reaction to extreme criminal behavior and law enforcement response to evidence of systematic human experimentation. The timing of the discovery raises additional questions about the true nature of the operation. Congressional hearings on military psychological research programs were scheduled to begin in early 1958, and public awareness of government experimentation on American citizens was beginning to surface through the work of investigative journalists. The exposure of the Gein case provided a convenient explanation for the disappearances of dozens of women across the Midwest while simultaneously discrediting any suggestions of government involvement by attributing the crimes to individual psychosis. The basement of the Gein farmhouse contained equipment that local investigators couldn't identify: surgical instruments of unknown origin, chemical compounds that required specialized disposal procedures, and recording devices that appeared to be government issue. When questioned about these items, Gein claimed they had been provided by the men who came at night, describing individuals in military uniforms who would arrive without announcement to check on the progress of the work. Photographs of the basement, taken before the evidence was transferred to federal custody, show a space that resembled a laboratory more than a root cellar. Stainless steel tables, chemical storage cabinets, and recording equipment were arranged with the precision of a research facility. The walls were lined with charts showing anatomical diagrams and psychological assessment forms, all bearing official government seals that were later claimed to be forgeries, despite expert analysis confirming their authenticity. The laboratory equipment found in the basement included specialized instruments for tissue preservation, chemical analysis equipment for testing preservation solutions, and recording devices for documenting experimental procedures. The sophistication of this equipment far exceeded anything that could be obtained through civilian channels and pointed to direct government involvement in the research activities. The connection between Gein and other notorious criminals of the era becomes clearer when examined through the lens of systematic conditioning rather than isolated psychopathy. Charles Manson, who would later orchestrate the Tate LaBianca murders, had been subjected to extensive psychological testing during his multiple incarcerations in the 1950s. Jeffrey Dahmer, as father, worked as a chemist for a defense contractor with known ties to chemical warfare research. The patterns suggest a network of influence that extended far beyond individual criminal behavior. Serial killers of the era shared common characteristics that suggested external conditioning rather than natural psychological development. Many had military backgrounds, exposure to experimental psychiatric treatments, or connections to research institutions involved in behavioral modification studies. The crimes they committed showed technical sophistication and systematic methodology that was inconsistent with their apparent educational backgrounds and social circumstances. Some say it was coincidence that brought Sheriff Schley to the Gein farmhouse that November morning. Others believe it was part of something much older and far darker. The timing of the discovery, coming just weeks before a scheduled congressional hearing on military psychological research programs, raises questions about whether the exposure was accidental or deliberately orchestrated to satisfy public curiosity while concealing larger truths. The women whose remains were found in Plainfield had been more than victims. They had been test subjects in an experiment designed to measure the limits of human cruelty and the public's capacity for denial. Each disappearance had been carefully documented, each murder methodically recorded, each transformation of human flesh into household objects catalogued with the precision of a scientific study. The real horror wasn't what Ed Gein had done. It was the realization that he had been doing it under observation, with approval, as part of a research program that treated human beings as laboratory animals. Share this before it disappears. And subscribe, not to follow, but to remember. Because some truths only survive when someone keeps them alive, when someone refuses to let the official story become the only story, when someone maintains the connection between what happened in Plainfield and what continues to happen in places where the lights never quite reach the corners. The aftermath of Plainfield rippled through American culture in ways that suggested careful management of public perception. The emergence of horror films featuring characters clearly inspired by Gein, Norman Bates, Leatherface, Buffalo Bill served to transform genuine terror into entertainment, allowing society to process the reality of systematic human experimentation through the safer medium of fiction. The truth became myth, the myth became commodity, and the commodity became a shield protecting those responsible from accountability. The cultural impact was carefully orchestrated to channel public fascination with the case into harmless entertainment, while discouraging serious investigation into the systematic nature of the crimes. Hollywood production served as both distraction and disinformation, creating fictional narratives that obscured the organized nature of the experimental program while satisfying public curiosity about the horrors discovered in Plainfield. Tonight, as you consider what you've learned about those November days in Plainfield, remember that official histories are written by those with the most to hide. The truth about Ed Gein and the 20 horrors discovered in his farmhouse exists in the spaces between what was reported and what was concealed, in the silence that surrounded the investigation, in the convenient deaths of witnesses, and the mysterious disappearance of evidence that might have revealed the true scope of what was being tested on American soil. Some stories were never meant to be told, but now that you've heard it, there's no way to unhear it. The truth about Plainfield lives now in your memory, where it will remain like a splinter of ice, slowly melting, gradually revealing the shape of something much larger and infinitely more terrible than anything Ed Gein could have conceived on his own.